Most of you will know Don. For those who don't, Don is a former president of the Radio Society of Great Britain and also a life vice president. He's been secretary and then president of the IARU Regional 1. As I'm sure most of you know, very active DXer. But he's going to be giving us the story of the beginning of global radio communications, as 2024 marks the centenary of the first two-way trans-global radio communications between the UK and New Zealand. Rather than telling you any more, I'm going to hand over to Don, and Don, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Graham, and hello, everybody. It isn't a long time ago, you know, 100 years. Sounds like a millennium, doesn't it? Well, it's a tenth of a millennium, actually, but I've been licensed 63 years. So it was not that long before I got my license that all this happened. So let's just put that in perspective as we go through it. What I'm going to be talking about today is sharing with you the events around October 1924, when there was a two-way radio contact, the very first two-way radio contact between Cecil Goyder, who later got the call sign G2HM. We think it was later and not at the time, but he was operating 2SZ at Mill Hill in London, and Frank Bell, who was operating 4AA in New Zealand. Cecil had been was an undergraduate at City and Guilds, which is now part of Imperial in London, and Bell's a sheep farmer in South Island, New Zealand, and the Bell family still own the farm, and it's a relatively small one at just 30,000 acres. The location is exactly here in Shag Valley. This is the bottom end of South Island. So that's where Frank was located. And the interesting thing about this is, if you're trying to open up trans-global communication, would you do it on 3.2 megs? Who here has worked ZL on 80 meters? Well, of course, we have a room full of DXers, I suppose. And Andy, that's cheating. Particularly at the moment, actually, it's not a particularly easy path. And to do it on 3.2 megs and with the equipment that they used at the time, as we'll see in a moment, was quite an achievement. So this is what I plan to cover today. First of all, who were the key players? Look at 1924 in the context of what else had been going on radio communications around that time. The build-up to that particular day. Take a moment to look at everybody's understanding of how propagation worked at that time, what equipment they used, what actually happened, and then some reflections from others of what this achievement really meant, and what happened to everybody afterwards, and how we're celebrating the centenary. So I'm going to move through this fairly quickly because there's quite a lot to cover. Cecil Goyder. He was operating 2SZ at Mill Hill School, and he lived close to Mill Hill School in Hale Lane. He first became interested in radio in 1915 when he was living in America. He was a kid, his family were out in the US, and that was what kindled his interest in the early days of radio. And when he came back to England in 1920, he went to Mill Hill School, and he started carrying on experiments about radio communication. And his equipment consisted of a spring mattress as an aerial and an ex-army transmitter. So it was fairly crude equipment, even by those standards in those days. He wasn't just interested in radio, he was actually quite a keen sportsman. But critically, I think, his interest in radio was encouraged by the science master at school. And the science master in the school was the person responsible for taking out the 2SZ call sign. So the call sign was issued to Mill Hill School, and quite importantly, it had a power authorization of 1/4 of a kilowatt. And in 1924, that was a significant transmitting installation. Most licenses were 10 watts maximum power. Mill Hill, because of the significance of the school and the potential of the experiments that were going to take place, had a 1/4 kilowatt license. And as we'll see in a moment, he got quite a lot of support in making sure that he could produce a 1/4 kilowatt. At the other end of the link was Frank Bell. This is a picture in 1974, but as I said, they're a sheep farming family in Wahimo. They're still there. Frank was always experimenting with radio, but not only radio, with technology. There's a little museum in the sheep farm in Shag Valley, and apart from his radio equipment, there's some old spark equipment, and quite worryingly, there's an X-ray generator, which shows that he had a fairly wide interest in electronics and radio-associated issues. He fought in the First World War, but he was invalided out, at which point he returned to New Zealand, and he chalked up a number of firsts in radio communication from New Zealand. So he was the first from Australia to New Zealand, or from New Zealand to Australia, the first from New Zealand to North America, and as we'll find out in a minute or two, the first between New Zealand and the United Kingdom. So Frank was a leader in the radio amateur world in New Zealand at the time. Interestingly enough, so was his sister, Brenda. And we'll find out a little bit more about her later on. Incidentally, I should have said at the beginning, if you want to stop me and ask any questions, please do so. We could do it all at the end, but I'm happy to take them as we go along if it seems appropriate to you to do it partway through. So let's put 1924 in the historical context. What's called Marconi's Atlantic Leap had been just 23 years before. 1901, that communication across the Atlantic from this modest multi-circle array that he had. Initially, of course, in those days, it was spark transmission. It was spark transmission, and the receiver was a coherer, an early form of diode, so effectively a crystal set. So that was the degree of sensitivity we were dealing with. There wasn't too much QRM to contend with because there probably wasn't another signal anywhere, but using fairly basic equipment. And then, of course, what happened during the First World War was valves appeared. And valves became available in around about 1916, which meant that the technology that you could apply to generating radio frequency energy and detecting radio frequency energy changed very significantly. And over those pre-First World War years, the number of wireless experimenters, as they were called in those days, grew quite rapidly. And we'll look at some numbers on a later slide. But as this happened, there were increasing problems with the near universal use of low frequencies. Everybody was using fairly low frequencies, what we would probably term today medium wave or thereabouts, or even longer. And actually, they began to get QRM. And one of the problems, which I think is on a later slide, was interference with Croydon Airport from radio amateurs who were on nearby frequencies. And of course, the authorities didn't really like that. So the Post Office started imposing restrictions on wireless experimenters on when they could use their equipment and what frequencies, wavelengths, they could use as well. Notwithstanding that, as we moved into the early 20s, there were experiments to bridge the Atlantic. We'll come on to those in a moment, culminating in this final global leap from 1924. So let's look at the UK experimenters. Before 1914, there had been pretty rapid growth to around 1,000 wireless experimenters in the UK. Post it should say 2014, it should say 1914, sorry. Wireless experimenter numbers had been growing from a lower base, and I think that was the result of the First World War, that the base numbers went down and then continued to grow. So they were at 250 by 1922, with a lot of regulatory changes going on in the background from the Post Office. The Post Office were imposing restrictions, as it says there, initially on the number of hours you could be on the bands, the number of stations you could contact. And typically a 4-hour period would be allocated during which you can make contacts by radio. So it was a moderately repressive environment in terms of experimentation. You had to comply with a whole set of rules and regs. And as I've mentioned already, only a limited number of high power licenses. 250 watts was really quite unusual, and it's not totally clear the criteria which governed the allocation of 250 watt licenses. It seems to have been a combination of technical competence and influence. Plus ça change. So a limited number of high power licenses. And this is the wireless map of Great Britain. And you can see each red dot comprises a wireless experimenter. And if we take a bit of a close-up to this table on the left, you can see the sort of information that was provided on this map. With all the original call signs. At this time, of course, there was no prefix on the call sign, so you could have 2AA in Slough, and you could have 2 something else in a totally different country. So it was quite confusing until there was a general introduction of country prefixes initially, as we'll see shortly, in a very informal way. So I thought that map was really quite interesting and quite telling. It's fascinating to look at it. Let's talk about the Atlantic tests. These were first planned, and this was an environment where we now had valves. We could generate RF using valves. And we could receive using valves, therefore we had greater sensitivity. But notwithstanding that, the tests initially planned for February 21 didn't result in one-way reception. So absolutely nothing. And the Americans took the view that it was the Brits. The Brits didn't have good enough receivers, couldn't hear a thing. And therefore they sent the Navy over in the form of Paul Godley to ZE with a Paragon regenerative receiver and also an Armstrong Superhet. Armstrong was well known as a developer of the thinking in radio technology, including frequency modulation. But Paul Godley came over and he started work in the London area and found that reception was poor. Whether that was noise is not totally clear, but he decided that he would take himself off to the northwest of the UK and ended up in Ardrossan on the west coast of Scotland, where he was able to get up a 1,300-foot Beveridge, which I'm sure helped quite a lot. And he recorded one-way reception of 1 BCG in Connecticut. So this again would have been on fairly low frequencies. But it's interesting to note that 24 hours before Godley heard the station in Connecticut, it had been received by Byrne 2KW in Sale. So it wasn't perhaps the Brits and their receivers, more the conditions at the time that prevented the early tests from being successful. So there was a lot happening around this time. Here's a timeline which goes back to 1898 and through to 1927, just a few key points. Starting with the first British amateur radio station. This was a guy in the military who later had the call sign EI2B. We've talked about Marconi's Atlantic Leap and the growth of the experimenters and the growth of licenses. But it's interesting to note that at the beginning of the First World War, Marconi was developing early telephony transmissions, and this was off the back of the availability of tubes, thermionic valves, and beginning to explore the potential of telephony communication. Interestingly, and we'll come back to this shortly, Fleming speculated on the ionosphere in 1914 in a lecture. I think it was to one of the London Learned Societies, but he took it no further at the time. And then, of course, in 2014, all experimenter activity ceased for 4 years. But as soon as things got back to what was a bit closer to normality in 1918, by 1920, there were some early signs of public broadcasting, experimentally to begin with. And then 1921, we were getting this business of QRM to Croydon Aerodrome and the first unsuccessful transatlantic tests. 127 experimenters shown in the Gamage directory, which seems the nearest thing we could get to a call book at that time, ending up with a lot more in 1922. 1922, so the post office changes in spectrum began to bite, and the 1,000 meter band was withdrawn. There was a move away from spark transmission. There were 250 permits in force, and what was probably the nearest thing to proper public broadcasting began in 1922. In 1923, there were some 200 meter long distance tests, and the Post Office proposed a 200 meter and down policy for amateur or wireless experimenter spectrum. So the thinking had been in the past, low frequency is good for communication, and actually anything shorter than 200 meters, 1.5 megs, that's no good for communication. So we'll give it to the amateurs. And that's what happened. And then 1924, as we'll see in a couple of slides, the first communication between UK and New Zealand. And in 1927, Gerald Marcuse began his Empire Broadcasting, and this is a picture of him with his transmitter and one of his transmitting valves, transmitting from, I think it was Caterham in Surrey, which really began the concept. It didn't last very long, but began the concept of Empire Broadcasting, which was soon taken over by the BBC. But in all this, there have been perhaps a certain lack of appreciation, because it hadn't developed, of the propagation medium, which is the ionosphere. And if we look at this, there really wasn't very much real understanding of the ionosphere and how it affected radio communication, although Fleming had speculated on it in 1914. Conventional wisdom was low frequency is best, and the transatlantic tests of 23 did begin to change that thinking, and once we got Antipodean contacts, we were beginning to notice the grey line effect. And the grey line effect, as we all know, is one of the ways in which we can contact New Zealand somewhat, well, probably the principal way we can contact New Zealand on 80 and 160 meters. And so there was a gradual awakening over this period to the nature of the propagation medium. The interesting thing is Cecil Goyder's quote of 1925, though, which I find fascinating. The conditions for good reception of New Zealand signals are interesting. Invariably, a cold, clear night, favourable for America, is no use for New Zealand. for which mainly a rainy, misty, cloudy night is the suitable condition. What is the explanation? An extremely good question, and it's quite hard to see that there is an explanation, and clearly that's some sort of coincidental thing that he had experienced. And I've just put the graphic here, as some of you will recognize, as the propagation map from Propi. So we had a fairly basic understanding of propagation, and we then had some fairly basic equipment. And this was emerging technology. Vacuums began to take center stage, and in the early 20s, a transmitter typically consisted of one valve, a self-oscillating PA, which those of you who have played with valves, particularly oscillating valves, when you try to couple an antenna to it, changes the loading, the impedance matching of the thing, and it can go anywhere in frequency. So getting one of these things anywhere near the design frequency was an art form, and in one quote, Goyder says it took him 3 hours playing with his clips, this is clips that go on the coils, to get the thing optimized and on the right frequency. So this was not a plug-and-play technology.
How did they measure frequency?
Do you know, that's I think it was Lecker lines, but they would have to be enormously long. I mean, I think probably like that. It's difficult to tell. It didn't have frequency counters, that's for sure. So we had vacuum tubes coming in for PAs. We had vacuum tubes in regenerative TRF receivers, which of course produce very significant sensitivity, but with pretty poor selectivity. The tubes gave scope for AM transmission, which I've mentioned already, but the circuits are crude by today's standards. This is Bill Scar's 40 and 20 meter transmitter, and you can see how many components there are, and quite a number of them are standoff insulators. So, you know, it's a fairly simple technology. The result is the signals were probably, I would even say certainly, unstable, which means that you need a fairly wide bandwidth in the receiver to follow them. But obviously, you know, you can only hear it within the range of the audio spectrum, so you're presumably tracking around to find. It's not co-channel working by any means. Who remembers the old days of 2 meters when you used to transmit crystal controlled and then tune high to low, right? This is it on HF. This is it on HF. And there is some speculation that this is the reason that Cecil Goyder beat Ernest Simmons, G2OD, to make the first UK to ZL contact, because Ernest didn't spend enough time tuning after calling. He was certainly the first signal heard in New Zealand, but he never made the two-way QSO as the first station. And then Cecil Goyder, shortly afterwards, noted that if you managed to get a quartz crystal to oscillate with a low-power valve and coupled just a smidge of that RF into a marginally unstable PA, you could actually lock it to the crystal frequency. So you could then have a stable, frequency-stable source of RF energy. And that, he took a patent out on that. And that was before we worked out that actually a much easier way is to actually put a crystal and then multiply it up until you get the right frequency to drive the PA valve. And then we moved from TRF onto superhets and the work of Armstrong, W2XMN, on the superhet, which was significant. Now here's a circuit diagram for you to do this evening. That's a 20-meter receiver, 1924 style, and it's, as you can see, what, 6, 8 components? The only thing to say is it's not complete, because up here it says 2LF valve. So there is an audio amplifier, a single-stage audio amplifier after it. But that was Godley, that was his receiver in Sorry, that's his 1914 equipment, but that's his 1924 receiver. Let's look at what Goyder actually used in October 1924. So this is the transmitter, a self-oscillating PA. As you can see, lots of scope to change the taps on the coils. You can see all these arrows showing where they're tapped onto the individual coils. And this is pretty fascinating. This is a synchronous motor coupled to a rotating disc with two halves to it, separated by some insulation, and it effectively rectifies the high voltage because the voltage goes in here, and because it's synchronous. This is live on one half of the cycle, and this is live on the other half of the cycle, but it's inverted, therefore you're getting half-wave rectification. And then it's rectified again, presumably to avoid all possible doubt, and smoothed. But notice the smoothing capacitors are 1 and 2 microfarads, which by today's standards suggest that it's going to be quite a raspy signal. And then the PA tube. PA tube was supplied on an experimental basis by Mullard. Mullard provided the tubes free, gratis, and for nothing. And the receiver on the right, even fewer components, but a lot of adjustment. Look at the variable coils, condenser, etc., etc. And then again, there's an audio amplifier on the end of it. But that was what he used. For an antenna, he had a flat top antenna on top of the science block at the school, and what's called a cage lead-in. That was his equipment. Bell's equipment was slightly different. It was 120 watts, plays Goyder's 250, power limited as we make our own. So this is a sheep farm in the middle of nowhere. There's no mains. They make their own power. A 5-stage receiver, 2 RF stages, detector, and 2 AF stages. Pretty impressive. And an antenna that we would probably rather like today. A 95-foot tower, wooden, with a 90-foot cage. It doesn't say whether the cage is vertical or part vertical. It looks here as if it's probably a sloping cage, but 95-foot vertical or semi-vertical, which is pretty impressive. Let's look what happened in October. We've talked about the Atlantic tests, and then there were some other contacts between France and the UK, two-way. The interesting thing is there are 2 years between hearing the United States and actually establishing two-way communication with the United States. 2 years to bridge that gap. And ARRL, on completion of the successful tests, sent a note to Marconi, which he politely replied to. And then there was the first UK to Canada, and the RSGB carried on tests, and the tests used code words. So you weren't calling CQ blah or whatever, you were just sending your call sign and a 5-letter word, like, the one I can remember is Zinco, Z-I-N-C-O. And it was reception of that code word that confirmed that this was not a spoof reception, that somebody had really heard you. And then the early 24, Goyder was contacting W6 and VE4 on the 80 to 90 meter band. And the whole concept of there's no future for communication on wavelengths below 200 meters was beginning to vaporize. On October the 17th, Ernest Simmons was heard in New Zealand by Frank Bell, and he sent him a note saying, "You're the first European amateur to hit out 12,000 miles. Your signals, QSA, every day here, can hear you every time you press your key." And that again was down around 80, 90 meters. And then on Saturday, because he could only go into the college on a weekend because he was at going to school at the weekend because he was at university during the week, Goyder goes to Mill Hill School early, and after working the USA, he hears this Z4AA calling him. And they work each other for 30 minutes. Now, actually, I don't know about you, but I'd probably have a spot of bother holding a QSO on 80 meters for 30 minutes with ZL today. So that was pretty impressive. And Goyder is deeply suspicious, and he says, if you're really in New Zealand, send me a cable. And goes back home and says, if someone's not been pulling my leg, I've just talked to a man in New Zealand. Imagine that first contact, you know, the first time you work P5, right? The same sort of feeling, right? So he was suspicious, but just let it run. And sure enough, the cable turned up. And there was extensive press coverage, much to Simmons 2OD's chagrin, because he felt he probably should have made it first of all. Bell's log is interesting. This is the value of log keeping, right? This is not, I worked G something or other on this frequency. This is a blow-by-blow record of what was heard and sent. And it's absolutely fascinating. G2 has said loud on about 100, that's 100 meters. AC ripple in the note, that'll be those 2 megafarad smoothing capacitors. No interference, keying perfect and good operator. Stronger than most Yanks and very loud indeed at start, falling gradually. I had just out a flat top off aerial, and I cut flat top off the aerial and shortened the counterpoise. Blah, blah, blah. 2SZ, gave 2SZ a call just for something to do. Now, this is at a time when nobody had ever communicated between the UK and New Zealand. I'll give him a call just for something to do. And then he heard 2SZ call a Canadian station, say, I can't hear him, and blah, blah, blah. And then Frank says, I called him for about 4 minutes, and he came back. And then this is the same text that we had on the previous slide. If you are said for a cable, and they exchanged greetings. Goyder's log, a little bit different, but same shape, and he's got the blow-by-blow messages here. And interesting to see the style of a QS of an exchange. 2SZ G Z 4AA. So you put the country in the middle of yours and the one you're contacting. Very interesting structure, which is not totally intuitive. And then at the top, it's owing to his steadiness and strength, I doubted the genuineness of his signals. This is the world first example of work first, worry later. But he did, and the whole thing is here. And I'll show you a little bit more in a moment. But this doesn't really explain the drama of it. Frank Bell's sister, Brenda, was a very interesting person. She was a pioneer amateur radio operator. She was a writer and a broadcaster. She worked in London during World War I and II, and worked later for 4YA in Dunedin. But she recorded her recollections of this day, and we're just going to listen to that now.
Then, in the middle of October 1924, I was in Dunedin, to be about the 16th. Frank rang up in great excitement to say he'd heard a perfectly good English amateur signal. I bustled home next day. I found him busily overhauling his aerials. Our tower was 96 feet high then, because it seemed a lot of chaps were using shorter waves, much shorter, and doing well. So we must be in fashion. So all that day we messed around. I suppose I got in the way, knowing nothing of what it meant. But an audience is often encouraging to a working man. He'd heard England twice now. This was the 18th. Always about 6 in the afternoon. So about 6 that afternoon I came in, having taken the dog for a walk, and looked into the office to see how things were going. Frank reported that he'd heard an Englishman working a fellow in USA, Massachusetts somewhere. He could hear both sides. And then the Englishman announced that signals were weakening and he couldn't hear, so they signed off. And we got the Englishman's call, G2SZ, on about 100 meters. Frank said, "Shall I give him a call?" And I said, "Yes, give it a go." And he did. Very carefully and clearly, the signal went up. 2SZ, 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 G, Great Britain, Z, New Zealand, 4AA, 4AA, 4AA. We were on 92.5 meters. We threw the switches across to the receiving position, and we waited. The strain was terrific. Though as we'd waited many, many times for replies that didn't come, we weren't over-hopeful. And then Frank heard a call begin, right on the hoped-for spot. Could it be? Was it? He was. Frank turned quite white. I can see him now. He couldn't speak. He had to listen. He just gazed at me. He gave a little nod. And I leaned over and put my ear against the phone, and I could just hear the faint signal calling us back. 4AA, Z, New Zealand, G, Great Britain, 2SZ. He gave a long call. Clearly he'd heard us and he wanted to talk. We had to wait till he ceased sending. And then we tore into it, because unless we got a direct answer, it wouldn't really count. We gave our name and address, and he gave his. A difficult name, Cecil Goyder, Mill Hill School, London. One of the big public schools of England, and I'd known a Leiden man who taught there once. We had the amateur call book, addresses. And as soon as he began to reply, we turned it up. But the name there was Brown, only he was the science master, Goyder told us later. Goyder said, "If you are really Z4AA, cable." Cable, I should think so. This was a world record. The world record every amateur in the country had been breaking his neck and blowing his valves to achieve. But it was after 5. The office was shut. Well, we're a telegraph office, and there are ways and means. We got a message to the cable office in Dunedin. We'd have liked to send loyal greetings to the king. We even scribbled some attempt, but we lost our nerve. He mightn't understand and think it cheat if it ever got to him, so we didn't. But we did feel that such an epoch-making event as the first direct contact between Britain and New Zealand should have been opened by some such homage. I suppose that's the most thrilling moment of my life, to see that space bridge, to tap out a message myself, to see Frank's face, and to realize that out of Frank's spare time hobby in the back veranda of a back block sheep station had come the moment when the knowledge and skill of all the wireless enthusiasts, amateur or professional, had been pooled with his skill and a good slice of luck to achieve this moment.
Right, that's it was off an old 78, so the quality is a bit iffy, but I hope you could get most of it. This is Frank Bell's card to Cecil Goyder. We sure made history that night, and I think you and I helped start a new era of world wireless. I'd like to say you're one of the best ops I've ever worked. And other people had comments to make. Sir Edward Appleton, who was a Nobel laureate and pioneer in radio physics, said a remarkable thing happened. In October 24, the greatest distance of all was spanned when communication was established between Bell of New Zealand and Goyder. Thus began what I've often called the shortwave revolution. This is probably the most dramatic moment in the history of the development of the shortwaves, when the greatest distance possible on this earth was bridged for the first time. And Goyder got a lot of publicity in the press, not just for this one, but for some American contacts earlier. And he is recognized at Mill Hill School with a large marble plaque. He went on to join the BBC and then the Indian Broadcasting System, which he completely set up from scratch. Got a CBE for doing that in '46 and joined the United Nations as its first communications chief. He died in 1980, which is not very long ago, and his obituary was in the Financial Times. So that was quite a dramatic event in world radio history, and it seemed to a number of us that this needed to be celebrated. So since the 29th of September, you may have noticed that GB2NZ has been on the air together with ZM100 DX in New Zealand. And from Monday, G2SZ will be on the air, including from Mill Hill School, and ZL4AA will be active from the original site at Shag Valley. So there's going to be a lot of stuff going on. Mill Hill are combining this with pupil experience about radio communication, and they're doing a social reception for members of the Goyder family. And we have on Saturday, week today, we have a QSO between the Goyders and the Bells. Sadly, reflecting today's technology, it's going to be by Zoom. If you want to find out more about all this, there's a website, gb2nz.com, which has got a lot on it, including a lot of articles from world radio history, which say a lot more about how it all happened. So I've more or less expended my time, for which I apologise, but we've got a couple of minutes in case there are any questions, so I'll just pause and stop at that point. Any questions? Have I overrun, Graham?
Don, the map you had before, which indicated the call signs, is there an associated list of names to those calls?
There is, and the RSGB has it. There is a call book. There is a set of sheets of paper typed which have got the early call signs and the names and addresses of those stations.
One here.
Tony.
Don, I wonder if you could just clarify one thing for me. Goyder said that he'd heard both sides of the conversation with the American guy prior to his contact.
Yeah.
He was obviously using one receiver, so he was retuning each time. He must have been, or working split.
It's a good question. I suspect probably. Just remember, the band was not full of stations, right? So it was not terribly difficult to find the other station. It was probably the only other station audible. Any other points? Yes, one at the back. It's Roger, yes.
Yeah, hello, Don. Just as a matter of interest, do you remember your first hearing or working with ZL?
No, I don't, which is interesting. I don't. I know my first real DX contact, and he's sitting right in front of me, actually, when he was in VP8. But I don't remember my first ZL, no.
Oh, mine was ZL2 Boston Easy, if you remember.
Oh, right. I do remember working ZL3RB on 160. That is something I remember.
That is good, yeah.
But that was a long time ago. Right.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Don, and you can go home and check when your first ZL contact was. I'm sure your log was computerised in those days.
Oh, yeah.
No, seriously, thank you very much, and all the best for the next week or so with all the activities particularly between Mill Hill School and Shag Valley. So we look forward to reading more about it in Radcomp. So thank you very much.
And come and work us. Come and work us this week.